One thing that we don't want folks to do is to say, oh, well, I have to comply with local law 97. I need to reduce my emissions, so I'm just going to throw solar panels on my building without addressing anything else.
Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration, and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your questions answered, and contribute to the community dialogue. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our weekly Passive House Accelerator live webinars. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Hello and welcome back to the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler, coming to you from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland in New Zealand, and I'm joined this week by Zach Semke. How are you doing, Zach?
I'm well. How are you, Matthew?
Pretty good. And we've also got Mary with us this week. How are you going, Mary?
Pretty good.
Really great interview that you're bringing us this week with Katie Schwamb, which I'm really excited for us to get into. So we'll get into that shortly. But before we do, Zach, we've got a few people to thank.
Yeah, we sure do. So first, a big thank you to FACRO for being our sponsor of the week and making all of our programming here at Passive House Accelerator, including the Passive House podcast, possible. Thank you to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. And to our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Ingui Architecture, Partel, Rockwell North America, and Zola Windows. And thanks to our champion sponsors, Bewizo, Cascadia Windows and Doors, European Architectural Supply, FACRO, Icon Windows and Doors, Intelligent Membranes, LG Air Conditioning Technologies, and Source 2050.
Awesome. All right. So just before we dive in, Mary, just give a quick background. How did you get in touch with Katie? What inspired you to do this interview?
Well, I just know that Building Energy Exchange is very involved in advocacy and policy in New York City. And I thought this would be a great time to touch base and see how local law 97 was going.
Indeed, it is. Very good, great interview. And we've heard quite a lot about local law 97. Even I know about it. And, you know, I'm nowhere near New York. But just very briefly, it's just a local law. Is that correct?
Yes, only in New York City. And as she mentions, only with specific buildings of a specific size at the moment, although there are plans for it to apply to a greater proportion of buildings.
Yep. All right. Well, as you say, she does do a really good job introducing herself and a bit of background into the great work that she's doing. So let's jump in and have a listen. This is Katie Schwamb.
Welcome to the Passive House podcast. I'm Mary James, and I'm speaking today with Katie Schwamb, Managing Director at Building Energy Exchange in New York City. Welcome, Katie.
Hi, Mary. Thanks so much for having me.
And can you just give the audience a bit of background as to what Building Energy Exchange does and how long you've been with the organization?
Absolutely. So Building Energy Exchange is a local nonprofit and resource center here in New York City. We work in New York City, in New York State, and beyond. And our main goal is essentially to help advance energy efficient, decarbonized, healthy, resilient buildings. We do so by developing and delivering resources to the industry. And by that, I mean, we work on research initiatives, case studies, guidance documents. We develop training and curriculum, technology primers, and we also then engage the industry. So making sure that the resources that we're developing are getting into the right hands of the right people at the right time. And we really focus on what we call building decision makers. So that's anyone who has influence over design, construction, operations, financing of buildings, all towards, again, that purpose of helping to advance energy efficiency in the building sector. And my background, so I have been with Building Energy Exchange now for 5 years. My background is in architecture. I got my Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Austin, lived there, worked in the building industry in the architecture field for a little while, but that ended up finding my way into the sustainability and energy efficiency sector. I did an AmeriCorps position with Habitat for Humanity International in Atlanta before coming up to New York, and had my first job at a construction firm, which was a really interesting way to understand the building sector in New York, and then found my way to a consulting firm called Stephen Winter Associates and was in their multifamily new construction team working as a sustainability consultant. So here in New York, that means getting to work on a lot of affordable housing, new construction and retrofit projects during design and construction. So working with architects and engineers to make sure that their buildings were complying with third-party standards like LEED for Homes or Enterprise Green Communities and Energy Code. And then when projects transitioned into construction, did on-site progress inspections as well as performance testing. And so that was my background before then joining Building Energy Exchange, where I've been working in our educational resources team and then have shifted into this managing director position where I get to work with a lot of the team across our educational resources and again that delivery, so a lot of our events and programming and training. Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks for that. And so, given that you are based in New York City, is it safe to assume that larger buildings are more what your organization focuses on when it comes to developing resources and education?
Yeah, we definitely do focus on the building stock that's predominant here in New York City. A lot of our resources have relevance across building typologies and even outside of New York. So there's definitely value in our resources if you aren't based in New York or city or state. But we definitely focus on a lot of larger buildings and that typology and buildings in general, because, we think of, as we know, or here in New York, our building sector is our largest emitter of emissions. We think about other locations that might not be as dense urban environments, and so transportation, cars, et cetera, are usually the maybe the more substantial emitter for them. But here in New York, with our dense urban fabric, buildings are predominant, and so we definitely focus on a lot of the larger building typologies, but do look across scopes and scales too.
Well, that's a perfect segue into talking about Local Law 97, which is, I think, a leading edge legislation in the United States covering existing buildings. And can you give an overview of what Local Law 97 is and, its general aim to improve building performance and reduce emissions from the building sector?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, Local Law 97 is a leading legislation package that was passed in 2019 as part of the Climate Mobilization Act passed here by the city. And it's a suite of laws aiming to drive emissions reductions in buildings. And Local Law 97 specifically establishes carbon emissions limits based on occupancy and use type in most buildings over 25,000 square feet. So emission limits started in 2024. And they get increasingly strict across a particular cadence of compliance timeframes and nearing zero emissions by 2050. And if a building is non-compliant, meaning it's over its allowable emissions limits for a certain reporting period, then it's subject to a financial penalty.
So it's not one of those flexible, mushy regulations. There's some very specific targets in it. Is that correct?
Yes, definitely. There are specific targets, there are specific limits. So you are definitely beholden to the law and working then to not only assess your building's performance, so see how your emissions, your building's potential emissions are stacking up against compliance periods. And then if you are over, then you're beholden or it's in your best interest to then pursue some retrofit measures, some strategic planning in order to help reduce your energy use and its subsequent emissions limits so that you can make sure that you are under that limit and then avoid risk of financial penalties.
Which are specified in the legislation. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe it's $268 per ton of carbon emissions over the limit. So you're also able to then calculate the potential penalty. And again, with these various compliance periods getting more and more stringent as time goes on, a lot of buildings for this first reporting period might not be subject to penalties. But come 2030, which is the next compliance period, because the emissions limit is getting stricter, more buildings might be subject to or might be at risk for getting a penalty based on their building's current systems and energy use and whatnot. So it's really in building owners and their team's best interest to assess their building's performance now and do that look ahead in case you've got, your subject or might be at risk for penalties in say 2030 or beyond. Then you can begin doing some strategic planning to see when and how you can begin to implement emissions reduction measures in hopes, again, of getting into compliance and staying in compliance and avoiding penalties.
Right, and it's not just the penalties, it's also your energy use costs. If you're not in compliance, you're paying higher energy bills, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's plenty of co-benefits that come from thinking about emissions reduction. And whenever you reduce your energy use and your energy is being provided by a fossil fuel source, then you're reducing your emissions reductions. And then anytime you convert a fossil fuel system onto an electric system, then you're reducing your emissions even more. So there's plenty of different strategies to get into compliance, but it's also interesting to think about, as you say, the energy use, we can reduce that, but there are other co-benefits. You reduce your costs, you get energy cost savings when you reduce your energy consumption, and plenty of other co-benefits from, getting combustion gases out of a building to improve health of any of the occupants and more, for sure.
And just to back up for a little bit, you did say this is applicable to buildings that are larger than 25,000 square feet. And this is all types of buildings, right? It's residential and commercial buildings.
Correct, yes. And even affordable housing projects are also required to comply with local law 97. They are treated differently under the law. So there all are alternative compliance pathways for certain affordable or rent regulated housing. Mainly was or has been an opportunity for a prescriptive pathway or just a delayed compliance pathway, meaning that they will still have to comply with the limits. They just might have a longer compliance time frame.
Great. Yeah. So for those building owners, I'm sure that, as you say, you're involved in the community of building owners and building decision makers. So what are you hearing from them about the biggest challenges they face as they start to think about how to comply with local law 97?
For sure. I think, just to start at a very high level, understanding what local law 97 is and if it applies to their building and what other regulations might be in the Climate Mobilization Act or in other policies or regulations that might apply to their particular building. So just even understanding, does this apply to me is, sometimes a hurdle. And then I think there's definitely, an initial shock of thinking then to, oh, I have to I have to tear everything out of my building tomorrow and spend, millions of dollars. And that's definitely like, I understand that reaction, but there's the the law itself is paced out over different compliance timeframes. And I think there's also this realizing that there is some strategic planning that can go into helping to get your building into compliance. So realizing that, no, you don't have to rip out everything tomorrow and pay millions and millions of dollars to do so. And even if everybody did, our grid system wouldn't be able to take that anyway. So the recognizing that there is some time. Obviously, we want people to start as early as possible and begin that strategic planning process, but you don't have to electrify everything 100% tomorrow. There are some ways to get into compliance over time. And then also, the regulation, Local Law 97, is definitely a stick trying to drive people and our building stock to perform better and get off of fossil fuels and reduce our emissions. And paying for that is always a challenge as well. And so knowing different financial resources, different strategies, again, going with that strategic planning theme, how do you begin to also strategically plan financially for how and when to, or how you can pay for certain emissions or emission reduction strategies, I think is a big one. And then last one too, a lot of coordination, whether it is a commercial building or a residential building, that since this law applies to existing buildings, we have building occupants. So there are tenants. And if you're trying to undergo some particular measures, particular interventions, particularly if it might have to deal with the building envelope or taking out equipment in occupied spaces, that tenant engagement and coordination is always a bit of a lift. So figuring out how to coordinate with tenants, how to educate them into what's going on. Do you have resources and strategies if you need to move occupants out for a long-term period in order to implement a specific retrofit measure? That level of coordination is also a challenge, I understand.
Maybe we could talk more specifically about owners of tall residential buildings, because what you just mentioned, how to deal with occupants and try and minimize the disruptions to their lives is a huge hurdle for a lot of projects. Has Building Energy Exchange, do they have resources to deal with this topic? And just in general, for owners of tall residential buildings, what kind of resources do you have?
Yeah, definitely. I would point to, since Building Energy Exchange BX, we are a resource center. So this is our bread and butter. And so we have various resources. Most of them, all of them are available online as well. So one thing, for example, that I will point to is our Local Law 97 calculator. So if your building is subject to Local Law 97, you can input your building's address and be able to see how your building stacks up against current and future emissions limits and see where you might be at risk of receiving a financial penalty. So that tool is helpful just from the get-go of even beginning to understand, like, where does my building stand with regards to that law. So that's one of our most used resources, particularly when it comes to obviously Local Law 97 and assessing building performance. Going back to just understanding the law itself, we have a Climate Mobilization Act, or CMA series. So CMA being the suite of laws that Local Law 97 was passed under. These are, resources and events. They're specifically dedicated to unpacking, demystifying Local Law 97. We have things like FAQs, and we also have a primer, so you can just begin to understand the law itself, whether you're, say, a market rate building or affordable housing building. There's resources there. And then I would also say, our retrofit playbook, retrofitplaybook.org. It's a resource that we did in partnership with RMI and ULI and was funded by NYSERDA. And it is a really great resource. It's a website that has information on a strategic decarbonization planning. It's got case studies. It's got a whole bunch of other resources where they're, anywhere from how to engage with tenants, again, case studies and whatnot. So that resource is also really helpful just to see what is available out there, what other projects have been doing, and how you can begin to think of this sort of strategic planning process for your building as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so helpful because, of course, the first step in any retrofit is coming up with the overall plan. And I was looking at one of your guides. I don't know if it's in that series that you were just talking about, but the high-rise, low-carbon multifamily guide. There were a bunch of case studies in there, and I just wondered if you could just describe that a little bit and sort of what some of the lessons learned that are in
Yeah,
that guide.
for sure. So yeah, we have a high-rise, low-carbon series. We have not only a multifamily building version, but also a commercial building. So there are two reports out there, but the premise is the same for both. It's a compendium of example projects from across the world, actually, not just in New York and not just in the United States, that underwent deep retrofit scope of work. And the requirements too were to have pre and post performance data. So you could understand how the building was performing prior to the retrofit and then looking at it afterwards. And all of these projects, again, large buildings, both commercial and multifamily, and specifically in the multifamily, obviously on that residential sector. So yeah, I think we did this building energy exchange. We did this in partnership with Level Infrastructure and Sustainable Energy Partnerships. And the project involved not only sourcing, finding these example case studies, but then also analyzing the data, understanding various scopes of work, energy and emissions reduction measures that were implemented in the building. So I think that, to your point, is a really great resource to look at just to get a sense and see what different project types at a large scale are implementing. So I think it's interesting to look at, and I recommend also maybe just to walk through it a little bit. We look at the buildings and the projects also through the different systems of a building. So heating, DHW, domestic hot water, envelope, ventilation, lighting, because all of those systems interplay with one another. If you improve your building envelope, you're going to, reduce your heating and cooling load. And if you tighten up your building envelope, you really need to be implementing, proper ventilation, both exhaust and providing. So it's interesting to think about like the balance of those and the interplay of those systems. I think some of the lessons learned or key aspects about that project is, for one, the importance of monitoring and tracking data and performance. You want to understand how your building is performing. How is my building, how are my occupants using and consuming energy? And we all know that you can design the most efficient building, you can even constructed in the most, to the T letter of the law way. And then if it's not properly operated, then you're at risk of losing those or not meeting those energy and emissions reduction goals. So I think having the importance of tracking performance as well, so you can begin to identify if certain measures or if a retrofit scope of work is actually achieving what you intended. And if you need to fine tune or optimize or troubleshoot anything, either at the systems or at the operations level. So I think that's something that's really important. Also, just transparency of data. I know a lot of times we've all got priorities and our attention is always going in a bunch of different ways. So I think there's making sure that those reports on building the energy consumption, energy use is also going somewhere so that somebody who knows what it is and can assess it and respond to it is also really critical, again, for just making sure that not only is your building performing as it should, but if and when it goes through any sort of retrofit, that you are achieving what you hope to achieve. I'll keep saying kind of the strategic planning process. You really want to bring on a team early. You want to engage them to see what opportunities or what interventions are possible or feasible for you. And that goes into, if you have tenants and that coordination, if one of the strategies is to completely, tear out all of the heating system and replace it, but you can't move out your tenants in a feasible way, then that measure isn't necessarily feasible. So how do you balance that strategically? So to that point too, like optimizing timing, particularly of equipment replacement. If you do have a gas powered boiler that's in your building, but it still has a decade of useful life, it might not make sense to rip it out now and replace it with a system, but maybe sooner rather than later, if and when it does reach its end of useful life, how can you not replace like with like? What technologies, what systems are available, what incentive programs and financial opportunities are available for you at that time so that you are improving the system beyond just what is already in place. And I think too, kind of going back or speaking to the financial feasibility or making the business case, looking beyond simple payback and upfront costs of measures, I think is also a strategic approach that building owners and teams should look at, especially if a building owner is going to have that property for a while, or if you have a long-term lease, implementing these measures will pay back dividends over the term of the lease. So thinking about that calculation or that framing is also, a good strategy for tackling retrofits. Yeah.
We've touched on so many important points dealing with any retrofit, but the importance of having your team in place and also the importance of quality control, right? That because commissioning is often an overlooked step, but if you have the energy data post retrofit measures, then it makes it so much easier to see, is it performing as you expected?
Yeah, functional testing for sure, particularly when new systems go in. And it's not just a set it and forget it. You will have to, revisit that system. And just as, good health practices where we should all go for checkups, we should also have checkups for our equipment as just part of our operations and maintenance. Good practices for sure.
Yeah. And you also touched on basically, which I think is a realistic pathway for many building owners, which is people who can't fix everything all at once. They just financially, that's impossible. And so they want to implement a phased retrofit where having a overarching plan is so important. Can you just talk about sequencing phased retrofits and, resources available for building owners, building decision makers who are thinking about that approach?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. I'll point to the retrofit playbook for large buildings, retrofitplaybook.org, and the strategic decarbonization planning. There's some pretty key steps in there, just some resources and language to help you unpack what that even means. But I think at a high level, it's, assessing your overall building's performance, particularly where how it complies with local law 97 or other relevant building policies. Or, again, here in New York, we have local law 97, but for folks who might be based in a city, state jurisdiction that doesn't have a building performance standard, you might have goals of your own. So figuring out how how your building's performing up against some baseline, and then developing a long-term master plan that keeps you in compliance across those various milestones that might be in a particular law, or say if you're trying to meet like a third-party performance standard, if there are particular metrics or requirements you're supposed to meet, and then executing it. And again, going back to monitoring, making sure that you are keeping tabs on the overall performance and compliance with the relevant policies. And I think when it comes to then actually like developing a retrofit plan, obviously factors, again, your capital expenditures, what budget you have available to you to implement particular upgrades in your building, available incentives, whether they are incentives, tax breaks, or other just financial opportunities. You have to overlay that into your strategic planning to help. And a lot of times too, you can do a capital stack. So you can see what, if there's an incentive program out there through one entity, but perhaps also like a utility has another program, maybe a manufacturer has a particular rebate available. So there's a lot of information to juggle, but all of this comes into play of trying to help inform you what you can, again, strategically implement. And I think, we all here talk about low-hanging fruit, so there are things that might have impact that don't necessarily have a particularly big ticket or cost to them, or are particularly challenging when it comes to impact on, say, tenants or occupants. So if anything from, we always hear about, LEDs and making sure that our entire building has energy efficient lighting, looking at, sensors, occupancy, vacancy sensors, optimizing our, say our boiler controls or the heating and cooling system. There's also, thinking about air sealing and weatherization. So we always want to keep the conditioned air in the building, and particularly too when we're thinking about multifamily buildings and wanting to keep having those apartment or dwelling units compartmentalized. So what other, air sealing strategies can you implement? Making sure all of our pipes are properly insulated, looking at the roof and making sure that we've got a cool roof, or, making sure that that high albedo roof, similar measures like that might not have, a significant cost that can also impact performance, are definitely things that building owners or project teams can look at. But again, really emphasizing, take a look at your building systems. What equipment do you have? What's its end of life? Can you map that out across time? And then making sure that you're keeping an eye on particular deadlines for regulation or potential incentive programs that can help you implement that at a particular time. And that includes, again, if we can reduce our energy use, if our energy is coming from fossil fuel-based systems, you're gonna reduce your emissions. And so kind of going back to also the interplay between systems, I think too, folks might not don't sleep on building envelope improvements, because they can also help with your system loads and help reduce emissions. Yeah, emissions as well.
Great. And do you know, you said there was a 2024 period where the first set of emissions targets had to be met. Do you have any data on how that went? Because, and again, there are financial penalties. Did they start being levied for buildings that were out of compliance?
I don't know if penalties are already being levied. I know that there have been some opportunities for extensions. Folks can apply for extensions for reporting, which I believe runs through the end of this year, which is 2025. Don't quote me on that. But my understanding is that reports are coming in. This has been, a big blitz for building owners and project teams to do the reporting. And then from there, with the assessment, I think then potential penalties will be rolled out. But as of right now, I don't know if penalties have been levied for any folks that have already reported and might show noncompliance.
And you mentioned that there are some financial incentives, you mentioned rebates, you mentioned some others. Are there any others? I imagine NYSERDA being very much involved in energy efficiency for buildings, that maybe there's some funding through NYSERDA or other things that could
Yeah.
help building owners.
Yeah, at a high level, I would just say definitely. So NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, is a great asset when it comes to opportunities for funding, for technical assistance, as well as, financial assistance. I recommend checking out their website to see the latest and greatest, but I understand that they've had incentive programs for energy efficiency upgrades, opportunities for energy audits. Again, going back to that, the importance of understanding how your building is performing so that you can then make strategic improvements based on your building's particular systems and performance, as well as, financial opportunities for, again, installing energy efficient technologies or systems. So always check out their website for the latest and greatest to see what programs might apply to you or your building, and any particular, time frames, if a program is sunsetting or if there are any particular deadlines. Utilities, so Con Edison here in New York is also another opportunity. They've got various programs and incentive opportunities. Well, this applies to multifamily as well as commercial buildings, both with regards to installing new systems. So thinking about perhaps, say, converting your gas boiler to heat pumps. I understand too that they also have programs for just general energy efficiency besides electrification. So thinking about energy efficiency, improving your building's performance, and then electrification being, say, to like swap out fossil fuel systems for electric systems like heat pumps. So those are a couple of that come to mind. There's also, financial institutions. So thinking about Community Preservation Corporation, CPC, and NYSEC, that's the New York City Energy Efficiency Corporation. Both are entities that help finance energy efficient and clean energy projects, through different offerings, say like loans or bridge incentives or that sort of thing. So those, as well as with all of this, definitely check out those entities and see what they might have available at this time or potentially in the future. And then we'll see if these are at like city and state level. Fingers crossed that the federal level also begins to help support these projects and endeavors once again as well. So there's not only a few different tools that you can put to use, but also looking at it across scales and across sectors to source resources too.
Well, thank you so much. You have been a fount of information, and clearly, anybody who's contemplating retrofit there should check out the retrofitplaybook.org because it sounds like there's a ton of resources there.
And I'll just give just a general plug. So Building Energy Exchange, BX, we are at be-exchange.org. And so a lot of the resources that we develop, anything from, again, those resources, case studies, tech primers, different courses, they're all available on our website as well. And we have various trainings and events. So you can sign up for our newsletter to get the latest and greatest, or just visit our website to peruse our resource library to see if there's anything interesting or applicable to you and your project.
And that was Katie Schwamb giving us a bit of an update on Local Law 97 and all the great things that are happening in New York. And yeah, really encouraging. I thought, Mary, that there's some really great incentives in that local area. Obviously, starting to have some real impact, and some potential penalties as well. So I think it's really encouraging to see some leadership come, even if it is just one city. It's a pretty big city, and obviously having quite a big impact in that area, and not just theoretical. The other thing that stood out for me is that emphasis on measuring actual performance, which I think is easily overlooked sometimes, because it requires us to be very honest about the impact of what is actually happening. But some really, it sounds like that local law is having some real traction and is really affecting change. Is that the impression that you get, Mary?
Absolutely. Because of the compliance period, first compliance period, I believe, was 2024. And so already people are starting to get notices about whether they're in compliance or out of compliance. And there are actual financial penalties from not being in compliance that are looming for these building owners. So as Katie said, it's definitely a stick that, is helping retrofits along in ways that just don't happen in places without this kind of legislation.
Yeah. Zach, what stood out for you?
Well, I mean, I think it's one thing that we should note is that it impacts 50,000 buildings in New York City, according to the Urban Green Council. So this is that's how many buildings in New York City are 25,000 square feet or larger. So it's a really, really big deal, and has, obviously can have a major impact there. I wanted to just note, I mean, it was incredible, and I'm a huge fan of Building Energy Exchange and the work that they do, and just the resources that were being shared in this conversation alone were, just totally golden. And so I definitely encourage folks to dive into all that they've got on their website. One of the things I think is important for us to understand as well is that the energy mix, the electricity, the carbon intensity of the electricity that serves New York City is actually quite high. So we know that just electrifying, if you were just to go 1-to-1 electrification, and use the same amount of energy for a building, you wouldn't actually be reducing carbon yet, because it is still dirty. And that, well, of course, we hope and expect that that's going to change over time, and that it is really important to electrify for that reason, so that as the energy mix gets cleaner and cleaner, the emissions related to heating and cooling and running our buildings will also go down. But right now,
what is the main reason for that, Zach? What's the most common fuel?
There's tons of gas,
Right.
and they also retired a nuclear facility recently, so it actually has increased in the most recent history. But part of electrification is also moving to heat pumps, and they have a coefficient of performance of 3 or greater, right? So the efficiency that's inherent in electrifying in that equipment is a big deal. So there is that benefit. But I think that just to underscore, like, the efficiency is critically important in decarbonizing buildings in New York. And we're not at, I think that it's easy for us to maybe assume, oh, well, solar panels and wind turbines are handling the electricity piece of it in terms of making electricity low carbon, and they will eventually, but we have a long time before that happens, and we need to nail the emissions right away. So
Yeah. And I
yeah.
thought that was a good question you asked, Mary, in that on that topic about what was actually being measured, whether it was carbon emissions or EUI, as you put it, which is the energy use intensity. And coming back to my previous point, it sounds like they are actually measuring the emissions.
Yeah. Yeah, they sure are. Right.
Right. Or calculating them anyway.
Well,
Um,
calculating
Right.
on
But
the emissions.
But Matthew, you mentioned a really good point that I thought was important overall too, is the monitoring, how important that is. I mean, just even getting the data, because that's part of the law's implementation, is that everybody has to report their emissions. Getting that kind of data is a huge step, both for the building owners to understand where their energy use is coming from, but
Yeah,
also for everybody to have a broader understanding of building emissions.
absolutely. Yeah. And as she pointed out right at the top, in New York, buildings are the largest emitters of, that they are the largest contributor of emissions in that space, and that's common for most urban centres. And the figure of 40% of national emissions often gets thrown around, but that's when you consider all of the agriculture and industry and everything else. But in cities, buildings are usually the single largest emitter. So that's a really good place to focus in terms of overall emissions from urban centres.
The other point that I thought was really important that she made quite clearly is that the next compliance period is 2030, I believe she said, and you need to start planning now in order to make sure that you're going to be able to comply in 2030. So it was very timely from that perspective, because retrofits are complicated,
Yeah,
and having a plan and figuring out a team to to conduct one, and especially figuring out how you're going to handle your occupants, especially if it's a residential building. It all takes a lot of time to think ahead and plan ahead for that. So that was a really important point too.
I remember when 2030, well, 2020 as well, but I remember when 2030 was a long time in the future. But 2030, we are closer to 2030 now, today, at the end of 2025, than we are from the start of COVID.
Right.
And I know projects that have been on hold for that length of time we're in the design phase. So you're absolutely right. Projects on the drawing board now or in concept stage, they're the buildings that will be around in 2030. And we also have all the existing buildings that we need to figure out how to get up to standard as well, and figure out those more complicated retrofits. Great stuff. All right. Well, thank you very much, Mary. Really great stuff. And always, I really like hearing about some local leadership, which that law, that rule that's been in place in New York is a really good example of that. It's been there for a little while now, really starting to have an impact. And I think it's a great example of where we don't have to rely on or wait for national or federal policy when there are these really great examples of local leadership that are making a really impactful difference.
Thank you.
Yeah, Zach, what have we got coming up on the accelerator and
Well,
over at Reimagine?
yeah, you mentioned the retrofits, big retrofit work that needs to happen on Passive House Accelerator Live on Wednesday, November 19th. We have Jonathan Stern of Cornerstone Real Estate Consulting and Matthew Bowers of the Oros Group presenting about a passive house renovation of a 1 million plus square foot commercial building. So please join us for Passive House Retrofit at Scale on Wednesday. And then we are joined this Friday with Craig Stevenson, also of the Oros Group, within the Reimagine Buildings Collective. So this is for members of the collective, which is our membership community where we bring together professionals who are working on passive house and low embodied carbon and electrification, all this decarbonization, to support each other as we are all making leaps in our work to make progress. So Craig will be on to do an Ask Me Anything Friday session for collective members about using data and building science to decarbonize existing buildings. So this is all part of our retrofit and reuse month within the collective, and that we're both the Passive House Accelerator and the collective are kind of moving toward the culmination of this focus on retrofit for the last month at our Reimagine Buildings Best of Retrofit Conference, which is an online conference for 4 hours featuring real projects and proven strategies that you can use at all different scales around retrofit. It's on December 5th, and an online conference that we hope people will join us for. It's an incredible lineup. Kim Davis, our programming manager, has been hard at work putting together a stellar group, and we'll have a link to this in the show notes, but the really fantastic speakers involved in that. So it's an exciting late fall, I guess. I guess we're in the middle of fall. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, get into that and everything else over at Passive House Accelerator and, of course, Reimagine Buildings. And we'll be back again next week on Passive House Podcast.